Miller Creek, Kentucky, isn't the kind of place people seek out for bright lights or busy streets. It's a small town tucked between the long stretch of the Appalachians. Those weathered southern arms that seem to wrap around every wooden house and every front porch where grown-ups sit with their morning coffee. Folks here are used to living slow. They call each other by name, ask about the corn crop, share warm loaves of bread fresh from the oven. In a place like this, peace feels like a given, and maybe that's why, when pain finally visits, it settles in deeper. That October night was chilly. The smell of damp leaves mixed with wood smoke drifted across the hills. From the high school field, the roar of the crowd carried through the valley. It was the kind of sound that made the town feel young again, as if for just one evening people could set their worries aside and live a night without thinking too much about tomorrow. No one knew that hidden in those cheers was a silence unlike anything they'd ever heard before. In Miller Creek, people like to say the woods have a memory. The tall pines stand like silent witnesses, watching the seasons pass, watching children grow up, watching families build homes and say their goodbyes. Down the dirt paths that slip into the deeper hollows, the night fog can be so thick you feel it on your skin, cold and cautioning. The elders in town half-jokingly insist there are places in the forest that don't want visitors, and once you step into them, it's the woods, not you, that decides whether you get to come back. And on one of those nights, 4 kids left the football game, their laughter still echoing from the bleachers. No one knew it would be the last time their footsteps touched the familiar ground of the town. No one imagined that just a few hours later, Miller Creek would wake to a silence heavy as stone. One that would drag the entire community into a story stretching more than a decade long. The real question was never why the kids disappeared. The question that hurt the most was the one everyone feared facing. What could force a small town where people trusted one another more than they trusted their own door locks to live with a secret too big to speak aloud? And if the woods truly remember, what did they witness on the night those 4 children drove into the fog and never returned? That night was one of those autumn evenings anyone raised in the Appalachians remembers for the rest of their lives. Not because anything remarkable happened, simply because of the kind of chill that makes you pull your collar up, the hint of pine wood drifting on the breeze, and the way the whole town of Miller Creek seemed to breathe in the same rhythm. The stadium lights cast a white glow onto the field, forming a soft halo that felt like it was holding everyone together just a little longer before winter finally swept down into the valley. Among the crowd packed onto the old wooden bleachers were the 4 kids at the heart of this story. Evan Blake walked ahead, holding a bottle of soda, wearing that easy smile that made people instantly trust him. He was the kind of teenager you'd hand your car keys to without thinking. Evan never let his friends end up in trouble. Josh Carnes was his opposite, loud, laughing before anyone even understood the joke, always filling the space around him. But beneath that noise was a heart that would protect his friends without being asked. Mia Dalton moved as if she was afraid to disturb the ground. She always carried a book, always stopped to pick up someone's dropped scarf, and saw the football game less as entertainment and more as a town ritual. And then there was Claire Rivers, the girl whose eyes always seemed to be searching for something deeper, keeping her old camera tucked close to her ribs. Claire liked capturing the moments between cheers, the ones where people forgot a lens was watching. 4 kids, 4 pieces of a friendship that stretched from their first Sunday school class to all those sun-soaked walks down dirt roads in summer. And that night, after the game ended in a wave of cheers, they just wanted to make the feeling last a little longer. They stood by the concession stand, snack bags in hand, feet tapping against the damp boards of the stadium floor, talking about the kinds of things 17-year-olds think will last forever. When the crowd finally thinned, Evan lifted the keys to his Chevy Blazer, a car he loved not because it was pretty or new, but because it had carried them through summers of kite flying on the river flats. Josh teased him, saying Evan drove like an old man. Mia only laughed. She'd heard that joke too many times. Claire watched quietly, hands tucked in her jacket pockets, eyes reflecting the stadium lights winding down one by one. They left the parking lot around 9:30. The air wasn't too cold, but cold enough for their breath to show in thin, misty puffs. The road ahead glowed under the headlights, stretching like a ribbon winding around the dark hills. They kept the music low, talked about weekend plans, and laughed more than the old car could reasonably tolerate. The plan was to take the main road home past the gas station, past the diner they'd lived in all summer, and back through the neighborhood. But Josh, as always, tried to make the drive more interesting. Leaning over from the passenger seat, he told Evan, half joking, half serious, that they should take the shortcut. The one locals called Devil Bend, the Devil's Curve. A coal-hauling road once, longer on a map but quicker if you believed you knew the town like the back of your hand. They'd driven that way once in the summer, when sunset painted the valley in orange and fireflies flickered like fallen stars. That time, everything had been easy. But tonight was different. Tonight was autumn, no natural light left. Just a black expanse like a bottomless lake and a thin veil of fog rising from the hollows. Evan hesitated. Mia frowned in protest. Claire glanced toward the tree line, as if the forest might tell her how to feel. But Josh didn't waver. He tapped the dashboard in a mock challenge and insisted the road would shave 20 minutes off. And even though no one said it aloud, it's hard for 17-year-olds to say no to a little adventure. Especially when you still believe life always gives you a way back. Evan tightened his grip on the wheel, flicked the turn signal, and the blue Blazer veered off the main road. The four friends looked at one another, part excitement, part nerves, as Devil Bend opened before them like a different entrance to the same town. A place untouched by streetlights, a place the elders said had a memory of its own. And tonight, the forest was listening. They didn't know that the moment Evan turned right instead of heading straight home, they had crossed a line one thin enough to disappear in a second, yet wide enough to take Miller Creek 13 years to understand. The next morning began like any other in Miller Creek. A gray November sky hung low over the rooftops. Dew clung to the wooden fences, and the rooster from the eastern farm called out like it always did. But in 4 houses scattered across the edges of town, a strange silence was unfolding. A kind of silence every mother recognizes the moment her feet touch the floor. The Blake house felt it first. Evan always left his shoes neatly by the front door the night before. This morning, they were still there, untouched, clean as if he had never left home at all. Evan's mother called his name, her voice still thick with sleep, expecting his reply to echo from the next room. But all she heard was the old wood floor, popping in the cold air. At the Carnes household, Josh's father looked at the breakfast table and saw the cereal bowl sitting exactly where he'd left it before bed. Josh never skipped breakfast, especially on Saturday mornings, when he was hungrier after Friday night games. Josh's father grabbed his phone and dialed the Blakes, certain Evan had stayed over. But when Mrs. Blake answered, her voice hesitant and trembling, something icy slid down his spine. Mia Dalton not coming home was just as unusual. Her mother had prepared the music for choir practice that morning. She stood at Mia's bedroom door, hand resting on the knob, imagining her daughter waking up, rubbing her eyes, and smiling. But the room was neat. The blanket smoothed from the night before, and the alarm clock blinked 6, with no one there to silence it. Meanwhile, in the small house where Claire Rivers lived with her father, her camera still sat on the table by the window, an unmistakable sign she hadn't left the house willingly. Claire never went anywhere without it. Mr. Rivers stepped to the window and looked out at the road as if she might appear walking toward home. But the porch was coated in morning frost, empty. Claire's cat sat waiting outside her door, its tail flicking slowly, as though wondering why its owner was still asleep. Within 20 minutes, all 4 families had called one another. What began as simple check-ins turned into long silences, shaky breaths, fragments of sentences no one could finish. Mia's father insisted they'd probably gone out for a late meal and fallen asleep somewhere. Evan's mother tried to keep her voice steady, though her hands shook as she opened the refrigerator and immediately closed it again, forgetting what she was even looking for. Mr. Rivers slipped on his coat even though it wasn't cold enough yet. He just couldn't stand still another second. By 8 o'clock, the 4 families were driving through streets they had traveled their entire lives. They checked every empty parking lot, every corner where the kids liked to linger, every breakfast spot the group visited after games. They called their children's names down narrow alleyways, the car windows fogging from anxious breaths. And everywhere they went, the silence only grew heavier. Mia's mother drove up and down the main road twice. She stopped at each bend, rolled down the window, and called her daughter's name. Her voice cracked a little more each time. The only response was the wind across the fields. Evan's father crawled down Route 12, where the boys sometimes stopped at the gas station for late-night snacks. He scanned every inch of pavement until his eyes burned, searching for a tire mark or the faintest reflection of the blue Chevy Blazer. At 9:15, Mia's mother was the first to call the police. Her voice was thin, each word pushing past a fear that clenched her throat. This wasn't just kids oversleeping somewhere. She knew her daughter. She knew Claire would never skip her Saturday art class. Josh would never leave without a note. Evan always called before bed. All of those truths had vanished with the night. Sheriff Crane picked up the call at the station. He glanced at the clock just after 9. But what he heard on the phone made him stand up from his chair. 4 kids. Not 1. Not 2. All 4. He knew exactly what that meant in a town like this. Kids don't disappear together unless something is deeply wrong. No one stays silent all night while 4 families wait for word. When the families arrived at the sheriff's office, they sat close together on the wooden bench. No one spoke loudly. No one cried openly. Fear has a way of turning people into the quietest versions of themselves. The only question that kept circling the room was the one no one wanted answered. Where did they go? And why didn't any of them come home? What none of them knew then was that the first hours are always the most crucial in a missing persons case. And as the clock struck 10, every heart in that small room was saying the same thing. This isn't normal. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is the beginning of something worse, something they didn't yet have a name for. News of the 4 missing teenagers spread through Miller Creek faster than any broadcast the town had ever seen. Within hours, quiet front yards filled with old pickup trucks, jackets thrown across open doors, and neighbors gathering silently in the high school parking lot. Nobody needed to be called. In mountain towns like this one, worry travels the way wood smoke drifts from an open kitchen door. Sheriff Harold Crane stood in the mist-covered lot, hands on his hips as if trying to hold the entire town steady. He'd found lost hikers before. He'd handled accidents on rain-slick mountain roads, but never 4 kids same night, same disappearance. What weighed on him wasn't just responsibility, but the trust of hundreds of eyes fixed on him. Waiting. By 11 a.m., nearly 30 volunteers had arrived. The men from the church brought flashlights and rope. The high school P.E. teacher wore a reflective vest. A local grocery store dropped off water and snacks. Some people even took the day off work, though they'd barely exchanged more than a few greetings with the missing teens. In small towns, grief has no borders. It turns everyone into family, whether they chose it or not. Crane spread a map across the hood of his patrol car. He pointed at trails, forest roads, every turn the Chevy Blazer could have taken. His calloused fingers glided over the paper like he was trying to hear something hidden beneath it. He talked about Devil Bend, about the old road that once led to an abandoned coal site. People nodded. They all knew the place. A route parents warned their kids about, with half-true stories of howling winds and trees that seemed tall enough to swallow someone whole. As the search parties scattered, the Appalachians opened before them like a gray-green ocean. The old trees leaned heavy, cast long shadows over damp earth. Dry leaves cracked under their boots but went silent after a few steps. The woods here had a habit of swallowing sound, as if they didn't want intruders to know whether they were heading the right way or the wrong one. Folks from Miller Creek grew up with that silence, but that morning, it pressed harder than any they'd ever known. Teams called the kids' names in pairs. Their voices traveled across the valley, only to dissolve into the mountains like something being swallowed. Very little echoed back. Some volunteers paused to listen. Others simply exchanged glances and kept moving, their pace quickening with a fear none of them dared say aloud. Nobody wanted to be the one to find something that would end all hope. Near noon, the team led by Bill Turner, a tractor mechanic and former coal worker, found a faint tire mark on wet soil near the second forest turnoff. They called it in. The entire search seemed to hold its breath, but when Crane crouched down and pressed his hand to the darkened ground, he knew immediately it wasn't from the Blazer. Just a truck passing through at dawn. Not what they were looking for, not a clue at all. By afternoon, Small traces began appearing. A candy wrapper, an empty soda can. But nothing tied definitively to the teens. The little scraps of debris pushed the volunteers into a strange mix of hope and dread. They wanted to believe each item might mean something. But they also knew these woods were full of wind-blown trash that traveled farther than people realized. Then, as the sun dipped low, casting a band of orange along the mountaintops, the northern search party radioed in. They'd found something. A broken wooden guardrail, splintered and leaning over the lip of a ravine more than 200 feet deep. When Sheriff Crane arrived, he stood still for a long moment, staring into the thick darkness below. A few volunteers shone their flashlights downward, beams slicing into the ravine like they were probing the throat of some great creature. A broken rail, a sharp curve, a deep ravine. Together they formed a possibility that made everyone's chest tighten. A vehicle gone off the edge, a tragedy no one wanted to imagine. Yet everyone knew these mountains had claimed lives before. Crane signaled for the rescue team to rappel down. The younger volunteers stood at the ravine's rim, hands pressed to their chests as though praying the truth waiting below wasn't the one they feared. The older volunteers stepped back not because of the height, but because they couldn't bear the weight of what might be discovered. Almost an hour later, the rescuers climbed back up. Their faces were pale from cold and exhaustion, but their bowed heads weren't from fatigue. There was no car, no wreckage, no skid marks, only mud, rocks, and tangled roots as if the place had never been touched at all. The broken guardrail was just rot. The kind the forest creates over time. It brought no hope, but no conclusion either. Just another moment where the wind had pressed against the weakest point of a town already stretched thin. By the time darkness settled, mist clung to jackets, to weary faces, to the fragile hope the searchers had carried through the day. Their voices grew slow and quiet, like even speech might hurt someone. They returned to the high school, where warm yellow light still glowed from the meeting room. The four families sat inside, fingers interlaced, eyes red but wide open waiting for anything. Sheriff Crane removed his hat and stood before them for a long while before speaking. Not because he lacked a report, but because he knew whatever he said would only deepen the void. He told them they hadn't found anything. No accident, no signs of someone running away. No reply to any of the calls shouted through the woods. Only the forest. And the silence. That night, Miller Creek went to sleep with more porch lights burning than usual. Some people sat outside, staring toward the mountains as if trying to hear something beyond human hearing. Others wondered whether the woods had kept something back. Because in towns like this, fear doesn't always come from the dark. Sometimes it comes from the truth that when you call a name into the forest, sometimes the forest doesn't answer. Time in the small towns of Appalachia moves differently from the rest of America. It doesn't rush. It doesn't push. It settles, clinging to every wooden porch, every lamppost, every dirt road. And when grief arrives, time seems to stop altogether, leaving each passing year like a thin layer of dust settling over wounds that never had the chance to heal. After weeks of searching with no results, Miller Creek slipped into the winter of 1993, carrying a wound no one could speak aloud. At the dinner tables of the four families, chairs remained empty, chairs no one dared put away. Instead of washing the linens, parents left their children's pillows and blankets as they were, keeping their scent as if it were a thread that might pull them back home. Sometimes a mother or father would stand in a bedroom doorway, palm pressed against the familiar wall, as though if they touched it long enough, their child might return. Mia's mother continued posting missing person flyers every month. She knew the paper had faded, the ink had bled, but she couldn't bear the thought of the last remaining poster being taken down without her knowing. Josh's father drove Hollow Creek Road every Sunday, stopping at the bend where people once believed the blazer had gone over. He would stand still for nearly 10 minutes, listening to the wind move through the pines, hoping anything would echo back. But the forest remained silent. Silent in a way that made him fear he might never hear the truth. In Evan's home, his football jacket still hung by the door, exactly where he always left it after practice. His mother refused to let anyone move it. She said that as long as it stayed there, maybe, just maybe, the door might open one day, and her son would walk in, saying he'd just been gone longer than planned. The door never opened. But she kept waiting. Claire had been her father's only child. He saved every sketch she made, every spool of thread she loved, even the early photographs where she'd experimented with light in clumsy angles. He kept them on the table as if she had merely stepped outside to breathe for a moment and would return. Whenever the snow fell, he stood on the porch looking down the road toward the woods. He told neighbors snow made the world cleaner. Maybe, if it became clean enough, his daughter could find her way home. The years passed, and the pain did not fade. It merely changed form, turned into habits, so small an outsider would never notice. The way Evan's mother opened his door each morning, the way Josh's father poured an extra cup of coffee and then emptied it because no one else was there to drink it. The way Mia's mother kept every voicemail her daughter had ever left. The way Claire's father wouldn't let anyone touch her camera. The quietest grief is often the grief no one sees. And as time stretched on, the story slowly shifted into legend. Children born after 1993 didn't really know Evan, Josh, Mia, or Claire. They only knew their names from the way adults spoke them softly, reverently. The Miller Creek Four. A phrase both cold and sacred. A story adults placed a hand on each other's shoulders before telling. Sometimes whispered in church. Sometimes used as a warning not to drive Devil Bend after dark. Some claimed they had seen headlights flicker across the pines on thick fog nights. Others swore they'd heard laughter thin as wind from the north side of Hollow Creek. And though few believed such tales outright, no one dismissed them completely. In Appalachia, stories like that exist in the space between memory and faith, between longing and the truths people invent to fill the void. No one carried the weight of this loss more than Sheriff Harold Crane. He was the last to leave the search site each night, the one who folded the maps as though he were folding himself in, the one who stood in the dark by the old bridge, asking whether he had missed something. After the official search ended, Crane grew quieter. People said his eyes always drifted toward the woods, as though some part of him was still calculating possibilities. He carried the case with him in his coat pocket, in his kitchen drawer, in the small wooden box beside his bed. It followed him into sleep, into dinner, into Sunday services. Some nights he drove out to Hollow Creek and leaned against his cruiser, staring into the trees as if trying to hear the whisper of something he had overlooked. He never found that whisper, but he never stopped listening for it. Time kept moving. Children grew up, graduated, left, returned, had children of their own. Winters of deep snow gave way to thin autumns of falling leaves, but the four empty chairs remained, and the story of the Miller Creek Four stayed rooted in every corner of town, in every older gaze that lingered a beat too long on their grandchildren running through the yard. 13 years later, when the earth finally revealed the buried blazer, many people said they weren't surprised. Not because they knew the truth, but because they believed time never truly buries anything. It only holds it until people are brave enough to look directly at their pain. And when the earth answered, the town understood. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the door opening onto everything they had avoided for 13 years. No matter how heavy the truth might be, it was still lighter than living with an unanswered question. By 2006, Miller Creek was a different place than it had been that autumn in 1993. The kids who once held candles at the vigil now had children of their own in school. Old storefronts had new signs, and the football field where the four teens laughed on their last night now hung extra lights to prevent accidents. But one thing hadn't changed. Whenever anyone drove past Hollow Creek, the whole town seemed to lower its voice. Grief finds a way to linger in the mountains like an echo that never fades. On a rainy morning in late April, Howard Darnell, a farmer in his 50s, took his old tractor out to the southern field to clear fallen branches from the storm the night before. Howard had lived here all his life. He practically knew every furrow, every dip in the land, so when the tractor's rear wheel suddenly sank and jerked to one side, he knew immediately something wasn't right. He climbed down, rubber boots disappearing into the thick mud. The ground ahead had caved slightly, as though something underneath had hollowed away. Howard knelt and began clearing the soft earth with an old shovel. When the blade struck something solid, ringing with a dull metallic thud beneath the drizzle, he assumed it was just a piece of scrap from the old mining days. Rusted machinery often surfaced after heavy rains, but then he saw a gray-blue color under the mud. A curved line of metal far smoother than the corroded junk he expected. Howard sank down on his heels. His whole body tightened. Mud trickled away in slow rivulets, revealing a surface he recognized so clearly, it made his throat constrict. He stared at it for a long moment before standing up to call the sheriff. His voice rasped through the rain. "I think I just found a car, and it's deeper than I thought." When the sheriff's team arrived, the sky darkened, as if the entire Appalachia sensed something long buried was about to surface. Mud was pumped out, water drawn from the sinkhole, until more of the vehicle came into view. Light blue. An older model, a shape unmistakable to anyone who'd grown up in these mountains. A Chevy Blazer. Same year, same color. Sheriff Crane, long retired, yet called in because no one knew the story better, walked slowly to the edge of the pit. The lines on his weathered face looked deeper under the rain. 13 years. 13 years he had driven past this land without ever knowing the answer lay just beneath this layer of floodplain soil. He didn't speak. He merely rested one hand on the temporary fence. Bracing himself, a crane was brought in. Cables fastened to the frame, already fractured in several places. As the Blazer rose inch by inch, clods of mud cracked away from the metal. The windshield was shattered, the body crushed inward, shaped by years of soil and time pressing down. It was the kind of sight that held people still, as though they were watching the past being pulled out of its own grave. When the door was opened, a smell of earth, metal, and time rushed forth. Scraps of old fabric clung to the seats. A torn sneaker lay tipped behind the front row. On the floor, a cassette tape molded, label faded, but faint handwriting still visible beneath the grime. The remnants of a night that should have been nothing more than a joyful drive. And then they saw bone. A small piece at first. Then more. Strands of decayed cloth wrapped around the skeletal remains, like the fabric had tried to hold the shape of someone who once sat there quiet, young. A pair of earrings still hooked to part of a jawbone. A silver hair clip etched with a pattern recognizable only to those who knew its owner. Little details, ordinary once, but now heavy enough to stop every breath around them. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. They had found the 4 missing teenagers. And they had been here for 13 years, while the town searched everywhere but this spot. Crane bowed his head. The rain fell harder, like the weight of every year settling over him. During the original search, he'd passed this land countless times. He'd stood less than 200 feet away, staring toward the ravine where people were sure the car had fallen. He'd parked by this very fence, listening to the woods the way a father listens to his child's breath, and today, the earth had finally answered. As each set of remains was lifted from the vehicle, the people closest turned away not from fear, but from a sorrow that felt communal, as though the town itself was remembering something it had tried too hard to forget. Each skeleton was placed into its own bag, covered, and taken to the coroner's office. No one sobbed loudly. It was the silence of people who had hoped themselves empty. In the back seat of the Blazer, they found a small notebook nearly dissolved. Its pages fused together, but a few lines of handwriting remained curved strokes. Blue ink. Probably Claire's. One torn page, half intact, carried the final trace of a sentence written under the dim cabin light. "We'll be home soon." Seeing it felt like time froze at that very moment. Under the front seat, they found a faded football helmet keychain. Just a trinket, but a young deputy remembered hearing it was a gift Mia once gave Evan after he scored his first long run for the school team. Sometimes the smallest things speak louder than any official report. Word spread across the town in less than an hour. People pulled their cars to the roadside, stepping out as if a story the wind had carried for years had finally arrived, one they'd always expected but never truly prepared for. Windows cracked open. Some neighbors held hands before speaking. A few families who still kept photographs of the 4 teens on small memorial shelves lit their candles again. Crane remained beside the blazer long after the investigators left. Rain soaked through his coat, but he didn't notice. He stared at the churned-up earth, the ground that had hidden the truth for more than a decade. He wasn't angry. He wasn't hopeless, just heavy with a sadness as deep as the mountains surrounding the town. Finally, he spoke softly, barely loud enough for himself. The earth doesn't keep secrets forever. It just waits for the right time to answer. The search of 1993 was over. But the real question was only beginning. Because when the blazer surfaced, when the bones of 4 teenagers were found, what emerged wasn't just their deaths. It was the truth that whatever happened that night was nothing like what the town had believed for 13 years. The earth had answered. Now it was time for the people to listen. The blazer was taken to the county forensic center later that afternoon. Under the cold white lights of the examination bay, it no longer looked like a vehicle, it looked like a message from the past. The entire frame was warped, its blue paint caked with dried mud, rust spreading like time's attempt to cover something up. But the truth, like any truth, only needed enough light to reveal itself. Dr. Avery Nolan, the county's chief medical examiner, was the first to crouch beside the tires. He remembered the missing persons case well. He remembered the way Mia's mother clutched her knitted scarf to her chest during the first vigil. To him, these 4 teenagers were not just a case. They were a 13-year-long hollow in the town's collective heart. When he shined a light along the edge of the first tire, the silence in the room thickened. The rubber wasn't split in a natural way, not after 13 years underground. It had been cut. Cleanly. Sharply. Deliberately. A straight horizontal slice. The kind made by someone standing next to the vehicle, leaning down, and slashing each tire one by one. All 4 showed the same incision. A pattern. Intent. Not an accident. Not chance. Avery straightened slowly. He knew exactly what this meant. But he paused as if bracing himself before putting the truth into words. When Sheriff Crane heard about the cuts, he closed his eyes, just for a moment, but long enough for those around him to see another piece of the belief he'd held for years fracture. An accident would have been far kinder than what these cuts suggested. When the skeletal remains were separated from the cabin, the room fell into an almost reverent stillness. Each set of bones was placed on its own table, handled with absolute care. No one spoke loudly. No one joked. They all understood what they were touching. Youth preserved only in memory, now reduced to fragile bone as light as ash. As Avery examined the remains of Josh Carnes, he found something that made him stop. The hyoid bone, a small bone beneath the jaw, was broken. The fracture didn't match patterns from a collision or cabin compression. It didn't come from force inside a vehicle. This kind of break was most often seen in cases of strangulation. A violent squeeze. A human act, not nature's. He set his pen down. Everyone around him paused as well. No one wanted to say the word aloud. Because once spoken, it became undeniable, and this truth was harsher than anything they had prepared themselves to face. The blazer's interior raised more unsettling questions. The gear shift was in neutral. The parking brake was down. The headlights were on. None of those details aligned with a vehicle plunging off a ravine or sliding out of control. Someone had brought the blazer to the burial site. Maybe driven it. Maybe pushed it. But definitely by intention. A calculated action meant to erase the night. That forced investigators to dig back into the old files from 1993, handwritten notes. Vague witness statements gathered during the chaotic first days. One name resurfaced. A man who reported hearing a shouting match near the abandoned mine road around 11 that night. Voices. An engine revving. Then, sudden silence. At the time, people dismissed it as kids messing around. After all, who would suspect anything sinister in a place where trust was practically built into the soil? Now no detail could be ignored. When the search team expanded the perimeter around the burial site, they found another clue. Tiny fragments of rubber, no larger than fingernails, buried beneath dirt, near a collapsing shed a few hundred meters away. The cuts across the rubber matched the slashed tires. In the slanted afternoon light filtering through the trees, the shed looked like a memory left out in the rain. Buckled tin roof, rotted boards, old paint cans, coils of rope, mud stamped with footprints too old to date. Behind the shed, they found something that made the entire team go still. A bent metal grill. Rusted. Snapped. But the grooves and material were identical to the grill of a 1989 Chevy Blazer. It couldn't have come from the newly recovered vehicle. Its front grille was intact, which meant someone had smashed, dragged, or collided with the Blazer before it was buried in the mud. It pointed not just to disposal, but to a struggle, chaos, from a night that had been hidden for 13 years. When the reports came together, each detail was a tear in the veil the town had wrapped around its own belief. This wasn't an accident. Not a wrong turn. Not bad weather. They had been stopped, confronted, harmed before the Blazer was sunk into the earth, and whoever did it couldn't have been a stranger. The slashed tires. The hidden location. The grill fragment. The shed only minutes from the main road. All signs pointed to one conclusion. The perpetrator knew this place, intimately. Only someone raised in the Appalachian valleys, someone who knew every unnamed bend, every unmarked path, would know exactly where a car could be hidden, and stay hidden, for 13 years. Sheriff Crane stood before the temporary investigation board in the station, staring at each photo, each diagram, each note pinned into place. His face tightened, pulled between two opposing forces, relief that the four had finally been found, and the creeping dread of what the evidence now suggested. Someone familiar, someone from town, someone who might have shared meals with them. Someone who stood at that first candlelight vigil. Crane exhaled. He understood that the answer unearthed from the soil was merely the beginning of a much larger truth. One they would have to face. No matter how painful, because sometimes the most terrifying things aren't what the forest keeps, they're what people try to bury. And now, those secrets were rising piece by piece. As the forensic evidence lined up before the investigators, the name that resurfaced in the old files left everyone silent. Gary Blake. The uncle who once lived off Hollow Creek. The man who left town less than a year after the disappearance. The one the police asked a few questions and then released, because there was no reason to keep him. A name that floated quietly in aging documents for 13 years, now rising like an air bubble from the bottom of a deep lake. Two detectives drove nearly 4 hours to the outskirts of Columbus, where Gary was living in a small house off a dirt road. It looked like any other rural Ohio home, an old pickup, a faded porch, a gray-haired man pulling a cup of coffee from the machine, as though his life had never held a single secret. But secrets have a scent, and when Gary saw the badges, his hands froze for a split second. A short, sharp beat, but enough for the detectives to feel something in that small kitchen shift out of place. Gary Blake in 2006 was not the hot-tempered neighbor people remembered from the 90s. He was older, stooped, with the worn-out eyes of a man who had been losing sleep for years. As he invited the detectives to sit down, his hands trembled not with age, but with memories shoving open a door he had spent over a decade trying to lock. They began with simple questions. Did he remember that night? Was he home? Did he hear a vehicle? Each question tightened his expression like a rope being drawn taut. And when they laid the photograph of the Chevy Blazer freshly pulled from the mud on the table, Gary dropped his coffee cup. It hit the wood with a harsh crack that seemed to freeze the air in the room. A detective later said that Gary stared at that photo for a long time, stared as though he were looking at a version of himself he could never forgive. Then he exhaled. A long, heavy breath that seemed to pull 13 years of guilt out of his chest. His voice was so soft the detectives had to lean in to catch it. It shouldn't have gone that far that night. That was how the confession began. No shouting, no theatrics. Just a man sitting in a cramped kitchen, admitting that fear and fury nudged him into a moment that took 4 young lives out of the world forever. Gary said he'd been drinking that night. Not a few sips. Drinking to forget the cold seeping through the cabin walls, the debts stacking up, the loneliness he never said aloud. Tools had been stolen from his land before flashlights, gas cans, and he'd cursed about it more times than he could count. In his fogged mind, any light on Hollow Creek Road after dark meant a trespasser. When he saw the Blazer's headlights flickering between the trees, his first thought wasn't of the 4 kids he'd once held as babies. It was that someone was taking what belonged to him. And in a drunk man's mind, what belonged to him wasn't even physical. It was the last sliver of control he still believed he had. He grabbed a flashlight and a large wrench and stepped into the dark. When the headlights hit him, the kids inside laughed. Gary said he couldn't remember if it was mocking or not. Only that it made something inside him snap. He shouted for them to get off his land. Josh shouted something back. Maybe a joke. Maybe a reflex from a teenager who didn't know the man in front of him was standing on the edge of his own breaking point. What Gary remembered next came in flashes. A step forward, a hand brushing his arm. A split second where he thought they were grabbing for the flashlight. Then he swung the wrench. Not to kill, he insisted. Just to scare. But the first sound in the woods was not fear. It was the thud of a body hitting wet ground. Evan fell first. His head struck the earth. The others screamed. Mia ran toward the car. Josh tried to lift Evan. Claire froze, a shadow in the dark. Gary said he panicked. He knelt to check Evan's breathing, but his hands shook too violently to touch him. He looked at the other kids, their eyes wide, terrified, knowing exactly what he had done. What he did next erased any path back. He told them to calm down, said it was an accident, said he'd take them to the hospital. But the kids backed away, Mia crying, Claire covering her mouth, Josh trying to decide whether to run. Gary said he didn't know who he was in that moment. Only that the sound in his head was police sirens. Prison doors. The town looking at him like the failure he already believed he was. So he forced them into the car. Evan in the front, the other 3 in the back. Their eyes, he remembered those most clearly. Not death, not yet. Just betrayal. From children who had once called him Uncle Gary. He started the engine. Drove through the woods. Deeper into the dark. To the lowest patch of land where rainwater pooled into a thick basin of mud. He still believed he could stage it as an accident. He didn't check if they were alive. Didn't dare. Maybe didn't want to know. In his mind, if he didn't face the truth couldn't destroy him. A cruel, childish lie. He slit the tires, each one, cleanly, shifted to neutral, turned on the headlights, and pushed the vehicle into the mud pit. He stood there a long time, watching the roof sink under the murky water. When the headlights finally died, he said it felt like someone closing the curtains on 4 young lives, but it was his own hands pulling them shut. At this point in his confession, Gary didn't cry. He just pressed his palms to his face and breathed out slowly. The tiny kitchen fell silent. There were no words. No sentence could fit the shape of that tragedy. No language could hold 4 teens buried in mud, or the crushing solitude of a man whose mistakes had outgrown any hope of repair. When the detectives asked why he never confessed, Gary looked out the window. The Ohio sky hung gray, as if listening. I thought the rain would take it all away. One simple sentence that chilled the room. He said that every time it rained, he thought of the spot where the car went under. Thought that if the earth didn't answer, maybe he didn't have to either. But the earth had answered, and truth had risen like steam from the ground after a storm. It was no longer his secret. It was the town's. Gary Blake was handcuffed in the very kitchen where he confessed. He didn't resist. He didn't beg. He walked out the door like a man who had been sentenced long before. Not by a judge, but by his own memory. And what he left behind wasn't just a confession. It was a question Miller Creek would have to face. Sometimes the devil doesn't come from the woods. Sometimes it grows inside a human heart twisted so far by fear, it no longer recognizes itself. The trial of Gary Blake took place in late autumn, when the last yellow leaves fell across the county courthouse lawn. The cold of the Appalachians had begun to settle in, carrying a feeling that was heavy and clear at the same time, as if nature itself were preparing to close a chapter Miller Creek had carried for 13 long years. People arrived early, but no one pushed or jostled. They stood in quiet lines, hats in hand, sleeves pulled tight, eyes lowered, as though asking permission simply to witness this day. Inside the courtroom, the front row was reserved for the families of the 4 victims. Each sat still, hands clasped not out of anticipation for the verdict, but because letting go felt like opening the door for emotions strong enough to sweep them under. Evan's mother held his old football helmet keychain in her palm. Mia's mother kept her daughter's favorite scarf folded in her lap. Claire's father had seen the silver hair clip laid out in the evidence photos. And Josh's smile looked back from the graduation picture his parents had never hung on the wall. When Gary Blake was brought in, no one whispered. No one cursed. A wave of silence moved through the room. The man who had once been broad-shouldered and quick to anger was now a hunched figure. Hands pale beneath metal cuffs. He didn't look at anyone, not at the families, not at the judge. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, as if it were the only place he still had the right to look. The prosecutor presented the evidence that had shaken the town to its core. The slashed tires, the fractured hyoid bone, the vehicle's location, the old shed, the bent grill fragment, and lastly, Gary's own confession. There was nothing to argue, nothing to defend. Everything pointed to a truth no one wanted, but everyone already knew. The 4 teenagers hadn't died in an accident. They died because of one man's moment of rage, a man they had once trusted. When the court invited the families to speak, none of them could stand. Only Josh's father leaned toward the microphone, speaking in a thin, steady breath. "I don't want to hate anyone. I just want my boy to be remembered as a good kid. Not as a victim. Not as a headline. Just Josh. A boy who should have grown up." The verdict came in the late afternoon, sunlight slanting through the courthouse windows. 25 years in prison. No possibility of early release for a long time. Some thought the sentence too light for 4 lives. But for a man who had been collapsing from within for 13 years, the punishment sounded less like a prison term and more like punctuation at the end of a storm that had consumed him since the night the blazer sank beneath the mud. As Gary was escorted toward the transport van, he paused for one brief moment on the courthouse steps, not to look back, but as if taking one last breath of the town he had once belonged to. A deputy later said his eyes were empty, like a man who had crossed the final boundary between hope and truth. Outside, the people of Miller Creek stood in a wide circle. No applause, no shouts, just a silence so deep they could hear the brittle leaves falling from the trees. It was not a silence for Gary. It was for the 4 teenagers, for the 13 years that had lasted longer than any sentence, for all the nights when their parents kept a porch light burning for a car that never returned. As the transport van door shut, Mia's mother turned away, pressing her daughter's scarf to her cheek. Evan's mother gripped the keychain so tightly her knuckles whitened. Claire's father gave the smallest nod, as though he could finally set down a weight he had carried too long. And Josh's father simply stood still, his hand trembling in the cold Appalachian air. That day, justice arrived. Late, but it arrived. No one hurried to leave the courthouse lawn. They lingered, watching the autumn sky dim, breathing in deeply, as though it were the first full breath in 13 years. And in that quiet, Miller Creek understood something. Justice can offer answers, but it can never return what was lost. All it can do is open a new door, one where memories no longer have to be buried, but can be spoken aloud, honored, and placed where they belong in the hearts of those who remain. There are small towns in America where time seems to run slower, where wind through the treetops still sounds like a reminder of everything that has been lost. Miller Creek is one of them, a town that carried a quiet grief for 13 years, until one spring morning, the earth returned a story the community had waited far too long to understand. The story of the 4 teenagers is not just a case. It is a reminder that loss rarely comes from the places we fear most. It comes from the moments we never expect, from a flash of anger, a single wrong decision, a human heart clouded by fear. And the cruelest truth is that loss always takes the most beautiful things first. Yet through all these years, what endured wasn't the guilt. It was the love. It was the candles lit every week during that first year. It was the yearbook messages their classmates wrote in senior year. It was the way their families held onto every trinket, every photo, every scrap of memory, the way someone guards the last ember of hope. When the blazer was lifted from the earth, it didn't only bring back the truth. It brought a reminder. Memory does not bury itself. It waits for people shaped by pain long enough to finally hear it. And sometimes, justice arrives not to heal, but to allow the living to move forward without a question left behind. Miller Creek has changed. The children growing up now hear this story as a lesson about how fragile youth is, about responsibility, about the kind of fear that must be spoken, not hidden, about shortcuts that can lead to places one can never return from. And if there is one thing we carry from this story, perhaps it is this: we cannot choose the ending, but we can choose not to let anyone be forgotten. Say their names, remember their laughter, keep the best parts of them alive, and tell their story to those who come after. Because in small towns, memory is how people protect each other when the dark rolls in. Thank you for listening until the end. If this story touched you, leave a message not for us, but for the 4 teenagers who never made it back down the long road home. They deserve to be remembered, and we are the ones who keep the light burning for them.